The Liberty ship Robert E. Lee cut through the Atlantic swells in the spring of 1943, its cargo holds packed not with munitions or supplies, but with men. Below deck, in conditions that would have been unbearable months earlier in the blazing heat of North Africa, sat 300 German prisoners of war from Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's once mighty Afrika Korps. They had surrendered after the collapse of Tunisia, their desert war finally over, their Tiger tanks and 88mm guns now scrap metal scattered across the dunes. Oberstfreiter Klaus Hartmann pressed his face against the small porthole, watching the American coastline emerge from the morning mist. At 22, he had fought across half of North Africa, from El Alamein to Kasserine Pass, had seen his panzer regiment reduced from 128 tanks to just 11 twisted hulks. Now, as the ship's engines thrummed beneath his feet, he had no idea that what he was about to witness would fundamentally alter his understanding of the war and convince him that Germany had never truly stood a chance. The first shock came with the meals. Instead of the thin gruel and black bread that had sustained the Wehrmacht in its final months in Tunisia, American cooks served them thick beef stew, white bread with real butter, coffee that actually tasted like coffee, and portions so generous that many of the Germans couldn't finish their plates. Hartmann would later write in his secret diary kept hidden in his boot that the food aboard the transport ship was better than what German officers had eaten in the best hotels of Berlin before the war. "We are being fed like kings," wrote Hartmann in cramped script. "Yesterday they served us roast chicken with potatoes and vegetables." Hans Müller from Hamburg wept when he saw it. He said his family had not seen meat like this since 1939. But the food was merely the prelude. When the Liberty ship docked at Newport News, Virginia, on May 15, 1943, the real education began. Hartmann and his fellow prisoners were loaded onto passenger trains, not cattle cars, not military transports, but actual Pullman cars with cushioned seats, reading lights, and windows that opened to let in fresh air. The German soldiers sat in stunned silence as the train pulled away from the coast and began its journey inland toward their designated prisoner of war camp in Arkansas. Through those windows, Hartmann saw an America that defied everything he had been told by Nazi propaganda. The countryside rolled past in an endless panorama of abundance. Vast farms with modern tractors, grain silos that stretched toward the sky like steel cathedrals, and most shocking of all, roads filled with automobiles. Not just a few cars owned by wealthy industrialists, but thousands upon thousands of them, driven by ordinary workers heading home from factories, by farmers running errands in town, by housewives taking their children to school. Every worker seems to own a car, Hartmann wrote that evening, using a pencil stub he had managed to conceal during the surrender. In Germany, only party officials and business owners could afford such luxury. Here, I see Negro workers, men who would be considered racially inferior by our ideology, driving better automobiles than most German colonels. The train stopped at a small depot in Tennessee to take on water and coal. Through the windows, the German prisoners watched American railroad workers unloading freight cars packed with consumer goods. Refrigerators, washing machines, radios, bicycles. A group of local children had gathered to stare at the German prisoners, and what struck Hartmann most was not their curiosity, but their appearance. They were well-fed, clean, wearing shoes that looked new. Even in the rural American South, these children looked healthier and better dressed than many German children in the cities. Sergeant Heinrich Müller, a veteran of the Russian campaign who had fought at Stalingrad before being transferred to North Africa, sat across the aisle from Hartmann. Müller had seen the industrial might of the Soviet Union, had witnessed the vast factories beyond the Urals churning out T-34 tanks by the thousands. But even he was unprepared for what they were witnessing. "This is not possible," Müller whispered to Hartmann as another convoy of trucks loaded with machinery rumbled past their train at a crossing. "Where are they getting the steel? The rubber? The fuel? We were told America was on the verge of economic collapse." The answer was all around them, though they didn't yet understand its full implications. In Detroit, Michigan, the Ford Motor Company was performing what could only be described as an industrial miracle. At the massive Willow Run plant in Ypsilanti, workers were assembling B-24 Liberator bombers on a production line that moved continuously 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Each bomber contained more than 1,500,000 individual parts, yet they were rolling off the assembly line at a rate of one every 63 minutes. Henry Ford himself had designed the plant to be the longest building in the world, 3,500 feet from end to end. The main assembly line was more than a mile long, and by 1944, it would be producing bombers at a rate that exceeded the entire annual aircraft production of Nazi Germany. But the German prisoners riding through Virginia and Tennessee knew nothing of this yet. They only saw the results, a prosperity so vast and casual that it seemed almost wasteful. At a water stop in Kentucky, Hartmann watched American workers unloading crates marked with corporate logos he had never seen. General Electric, Westinghouse, DuPont, General Motors. The casual efficiency of the operation struck him. These weren't soldiers or party officials supervised by commissars. These were civilian workers, many of them women, handling equipment and materials with practiced ease. "Look at their tools," Mueller pointed out. "Every worker has his own set. In Germany, even in our best factories, tools were shared among entire shifts." Mary Catherine O'Brien had been working at the Willow Run plant for 8 months when the first German prisoners arrived at camps across Michigan. At 19, she was one of nearly 200,000 women who had flooded into Detroit's defense plants after Pearl Harbor, taking jobs that had previously been reserved for men. Her husband Jimmy was somewhere in the Pacific with the Marines, and her paycheck from Ford, $55 a week, was more money than her family had ever seen. "We called it Rosie the Riveter work, but most of us were doing much more than riveting," O'Brien would recall decades later. "I was installing electrical systems in the bombers, work that required real skill and training. The company sent me to school for 6 weeks to learn the job, and they paid me while I learned." What O'Brien and her fellow workers didn't know was that their casual conversations about overtime pay and production bonuses would have sounded like fantasies to the German prisoners being processed just a few hundred miles away. The starting wage at Willow Run, 43 cents per hour, was more than most German workers had earned per day before the war. And American workers weren't just earning more. They were spending more, consuming goods and services at a rate that kept the entire industrial machine humming. The German prisoners' train continued south, passing through landscapes that reinforced the impression of overwhelming abundance. In Virginia, they saw tobacco fields stretching to the horizon, worked by modern machinery that would have been considered miraculous by German agricultural standards. In North Carolina, textile mills operated around the clock, their smokestacks visible for miles. Each facility they passed seemed larger and more modern than its German equivalent. But it was when they reached the industrial regions of Alabama that the true scale of American production became undeniable. The train passed the Bethlehem Steel Plant in Birmingham, where blast furnaces painted the night sky orange and red. Even at midnight, the plant was operating at full capacity, producing the steel that would become Sherman tanks, Liberty ships, and artillery shells. The German prisoners pressed against their windows, trying to count the smokestacks, the railroad spurs, the massive piles of raw materials. "This one plant is larger than the Ruhr works at Essen," whispered Corporal Fritz Schneider, who had worked in German steel production before being drafted. "And look, there are no bomb craters, no damaged buildings. They are producing at full capacity, while our factories are being destroyed nightly by Allied bombers." The bitter irony wasn't lost on the German soldiers. Their own Luftwaffe had been grounded for lack of fuel. Their tanks had been abandoned when spare parts became unavailable. Their artillery had fallen silent when ammunition supplies failed. Yet here they were, traveling through an industrial landscape that seemed untouched by war, where production was not just continuing but expanding at a rate that defied comprehension. When the prisoners finally arrived at Camp Chaffee in Arkansas on May 20, 1943, they found themselves in facilities that would have been considered luxurious by German military standards. The barracks were wood frame buildings with proper insulation, electric lighting, and heating systems that actually worked. Each prisoner was issued a complete set of clothing, including underwear, socks, and shoes that were in better condition than what many German soldiers had worn in combat. The camp commandant, Colonel William Patterson, was a career Army officer who took his responsibilities under the Geneva Convention seriously. At the initial processing briefing, conducted with German-speaking interpreters, he explained the camp rules and work assignments. What struck the German prisoners was the matter-of-fact tone of his presentation. There were no threats, no intimidation, no ideological harangues. The Americans treated them as professional soldiers who had simply had the misfortune of being captured. "You will be paid for your work," Colonel Patterson explained through the interpreter. 80 cents per day, paid in camp script that can be used in the canteen for tobacco, candy, writing materials, and other personal items. Officers are not required to work, but enlisted men will be assigned to various labor details including farm work, road construction, and maintenance projects. 80 cents per day was more than many German workers earned in a week during the final years of the war. And the canteen Colonel Patterson mentioned was stocked with goods that had become legendary in Germany. American cigarettes, chocolate bars, coffee, soap, toothpaste. Items that German civilians hadn't seen for years were available to enemy prisoners of war for pocket change. Hartmann was assigned to a work detail at a local farm owned by Henry Morrison, a 60-year-old cotton planter who had initially opposed the idea of German prisoners working his land. Morrison had lost a son at Normandy and had no love for Germans. But labor was desperately short, and the government program offered workers at rates he could afford. The first morning Hartmann reported to the Morrison farm, he was given a breakfast that would have fed a German family for 2 days. Eggs, bacon, grits, biscuits with butter and jam, milk and coffee. Mrs. Morrison, a small woman with graying hair and suspicious eyes, watched the German prisoners eat with an expression that mixed resentment with something approaching pity. "Y'all must be wondering why we feed you so good," she said through the camp interpreter. "Truth is, we got more food than we know what to do with. Government keeps telling us to plant more, produce more. Seems like there ain't enough ships to carry it all where it needs to go." This casual reference to agricultural abundance struck Hartmann like a physical blow. In Germany, food rationing had been in effect since 1939. By 1943, the official ration in German cities provided barely 1,400 calories per day, and even those meager allotments were often unavailable. German soldiers in the field were subsisting on black bread, thin soup, and ersatz coffee made from ground acorns. Yet here was an American farmer's wife apologizing for having too much food. As the days passed, Hartmann's work detail provided him with an education in American agricultural methods that reinforced his growing understanding of why Germany was losing the war. The Morrison farm operated 4 John Deere tractors, each more modern and powerful than anything Hartmann had seen in Germany. The farm used commercial fertilizers, hybrid seeds, and pesticides that were either unknown or unavailable in Germany. Most shocking of all, Morrison was actually being paid by the government to limit his production of certain crops to prevent surpluses. "Before the war, we had problems with too much cotton, too much wheat, too much of everything," Morrison explained one afternoon, his initial hostility toward the German prisoners having gradually given way to a kind of professional respect. Government programs paid farmers to take land out of production. Can you imagine that? Paying people not to grow food. Hartmann could not imagine it. In Germany, farmers were being forced to surrender their livestock to feed the army, their horses to pull artillery, their sons to fight in Russia. German agriculture was collapsing under the weight of war demands, while American agriculture was being asked to slow down to prevent overproduction. The technical sophistication of American farming equipment became a daily reminder of the industrial gap between the two nations. The John Deere Model, a tractor that Hartmann operated, produced 30 horsepower and could pull a 4-bottom plow at speeds that would have been impossible with German equipment. The tractor's hydraulic lift system, 3-point hitch, and power takeoff capabilities represented engineering advances that German manufacturers had never achieved. "This one machine can do the work of 20 horses," Hartmann wrote in his diary. "And Morrison has 4 of them. He tells me that John Deere produced more than 75,000 tractors last year, even while building tank transmissions and other military equipment. How can our leaders compete with such industrial capacity?" The question haunted Hartmann as he worked through the summer of 1943. Every aspect of American life he encountered reinforced the same theme. A nation whose industrial and agricultural capacity was so vast that it could simultaneously fight a global war and maintain living standards that exceeded those of peacetime Germany. The camp canteen provided another window into American abundance. Stocked with products from companies whose names would become legendary: Coca-Cola, Hershey, Lucky Strike, Camel, it offered German prisoners access to consumer goods that had been luxuries even in pre-war Germany. A 5-cent Coca-Cola contained more sugar than most German civilians saw in a month. A Hershey's chocolate bar represented more cocoa than the average German had consumed since the war began. Sergeant Müller, the Stalingrad veteran, became something of a camp economist, calculating the implications of what they were witnessing. "Do you realize," he told Hartmann one evening, "that the money we earn in 1 week here would buy more food than a German worker's monthly wages? And we are prisoners of war." The mathematics of American prosperity were indeed staggering. The average American worker in 1943 earned approximately $37 per week. Even accounting for the higher cost of living in America, this represented purchasing power that exceeded German standards by factors of 10 or 20. American workers were buying automobiles, refrigerators, and homes while their German counterparts were struggling to obtain basic necessities. But it wasn't just the quantity of American production that impressed the German prisoners. It was the quality and sophistication of American technology. When Hartmann's work detail was assigned to help repair roads near the camp, they were introduced to American construction equipment that represented engineering advances German industry had never achieved. The Caterpillar D7 bulldozer that cleared the roadway generated 120 horsepower from its diesel engine and could move tons of earth with each pass. Its hydraulic blade control system, steel track design, and integrated power systems represented manufacturing capabilities that German industry, even at its pre-war peak, had never mastered. The American road building operation used graders, rollers, and paving machines that worked with precision and efficiency that German construction crews could only dream of achieving. "Their machines work all day without breaking down," observed Corporal Schneider, whose pre-war experience in German construction made him an expert witness to the technological gap. "In Germany, we would need 10 men with hand tools to accomplish what one American machine operator does in an hour." The reliability and durability of American equipment became a constant theme in the prisoners' observations. German military equipment, even when new, required constant maintenance and frequent repairs. American civilian equipment, operated by relatively unskilled labor, functioned day after day with minimal attention. The implications for military production were obvious. If American civilian equipment was this reliable, what must their military equipment be like? The answer came in glimpses, usually through conversations with American guards or civilian workers. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Malley, a regular Army NCO who supervised the German work details, had served with armored units before being assigned to guard duty. He spoke enough German to communicate with the prisoners, and his casual references to American military equipment provided insights that German intelligence would have paid fortunes to obtain. "You guys had pretty good tanks," O'Malley told Hartmann one afternoon as they watched a freight train loaded with military vehicles roll past the work site. "That Tiger tank was a real monster. But you know what? We're making Sherman tanks so fast now that we can afford to lose 3 of them for every one of yours we kill. And our new M26 Pershing tank is bigger and better than your Tiger." The casual reference to acceptable loss ratios revealed a strategic mindset that German commanders could barely comprehend. German tank production peaked at approximately 2,000 units per year. American tank production in 1943 exceeded 29,500 units more in 1 year than Germany produced during the entire war. American strategic planning could accommodate losing equipment because American industry could replace it faster than German industry could destroy it. This industrial supremacy extended to every category of military equipment. American aircraft production in 1944 would exceed 96,000 units, while German production struggled to reach half that number. American shipbuilding achieved rates that bordered on the miraculous. Liberty ships were being launched faster than German submarines could sink them, and by 1944, American shipyards were producing vessels at a rate that exceeded the combined output of all other nations. The scale of American production became a daily lesson for the German prisoners. Freight trains passed their work sites constantly, carrying loads that revealed the scope of the American war effort. Flat cars loaded with tanks, boxcars filled with ammunition, gondola cars carrying steel plate, tank cars transporting aviation fuel. Each train represented production capacity that Germany had never possessed. Winter in Arkansas provided another education in American abundance. The camp barracks were heated to temperatures that would have been considered luxurious in German homes. Each building had a coal-fired furnace that maintained interior temperatures of 70 degrees Fahrenheit, even when outside temperatures dropped below freezing. In Germany, fuel shortages meant that most civilian buildings were barely heated at all, and even military facilities conserved fuel by maintaining temperatures that were merely above freezing. The coal that heated Camp Chaffee came from mines in Pennsylvania and West Virginia that were producing at levels that dwarfed German coal production. American coal mines extracted over 600 million tons of coal per year, using mining equipment and techniques that made German mines look primitive by comparison. American miners worked 8-hour shifts with power tools, modern ventilation systems, and safety equipment. German miners, by contrast, worked longer hours with hand tools in increasingly dangerous conditions as experienced workers were drafted into military service. Christmas of 1943 provided the most striking demonstration of American abundance that the German prisoners had yet witnessed. The International Red Cross, working with American civilian organizations, arranged for Christmas packages to be distributed to all prisoners of war. Each German prisoner received a package containing items that most had not seen since before the war: chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, canned meat, cheese, and various personal items. But what impressed the Germans even more was the casual generosity of local American civilians. Despite the fact that America was at war with Germany, despite the fact that many local families had sons fighting German forces in Italy and preparing for the invasion of France, American church groups and civic organizations donated additional gifts for the German prisoners. The gifts were not elaborate simple items like warm socks, writing paper, and homemade cookies, but they represented a level of prosperity that allowed Americans to be generous even to their enemies. Hartmann received a wool scarf knitted by a church group in Little Rock. The accompanying note, written in broken German, wished him well and expressed hope that the war would end soon so he could return home to his family. The woman who had knitted the scarf had a son serving with the Army Air Forces somewhere in the Pacific, yet she had taken time to create a gift for a German prisoner. What kind of nation can afford to be kind to its enemies? Hartmann wrote in his diary. In Germany, we barely have enough for our own people, yet here they give gifts to prisoners. Their prosperity must be beyond anything we imagined. The spring of 1944 brought news of the Allied landings in Italy and the preparations for the invasion of France. For the German prisoners, each military bulletin reinforced their growing understanding of the hopelessness of Germany's position. The forces that America was deploying in Europe represented only a fraction of its total military production. The majority of American military output was being directed toward the Pacific War against Japan, yet even this partial commitment was overwhelming German defenses. The numbers that filtered through to the prisoners were staggering. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, involved more than 150,000 Allied troops supported by more than 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft. The logistics of the operation, transporting men, equipment, fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies across the English Channel and maintaining supply lines throughout the campaign, represented organizational capabilities that German planners had never achieved even in their most successful operations. American production statistics, when they became available, revealed the full scope of the industrial miracle the German prisoners had been witnessing. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,379 aircraft, 29,500 tanks, 17 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, and 444 million artillery shells. These numbers represented production rates that exceeded the combined output of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The aircraft production figures were particularly devastating to German morale. In 1944, America produced more military aircraft than Japan had manufactured during the entire war from 1939 to 1945. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers that were beginning to appear in the Pacific represented technology and manufacturing capabilities that Germany had never approached. Each B-29 cost more than $600,000 and incorporated innovations in pressurization, fire control systems, and defensive armament that made it nearly invulnerable to Japanese interceptors. But even more impressive than individual aircraft were the production systems that created them. The Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas, could produce B-29 bombers at a rate of one every 4 days. The plant employed more than 30,000 workers operating in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The assembly line system, quality control procedures, and supply chain management represented industrial organization at a level that German industry had never achieved. Summer work assignments in 1944 gave the German prisoners additional insights into American agricultural abundance. Hartmann's detail was assigned to help with wheat harvest on Morrison's farm, an operation that revealed the scale and efficiency of American food production. The combined harvester that cut and threshed the wheat in a single operation could harvest 50 acres per day, accomplishing in hours what would have required weeks of labor with German equipment. The wheat yield 42 bushels per acre exceeded German agricultural productivity by significant margins. American hybrid seed varieties, commercial fertilizers, and modern farming techniques produced crop yields that German farmers could never achieve. And the harvested wheat was just a small part of American agricultural output that included corn, soybeans, cotton, livestock, and dairy products at levels that could feed not only America but much of the Allied world. This one farm produces more food than an entire German district, observed Mueller, who had grown up on a farm in Bavaria. And Morrison tells me there are millions of farms like this across America. How can our people compete against such abundance? The question was rhetorical, but the implications were clear. German agriculture, even before the war, had been insufficient to feed the German population. Germany had depended on food imports from Eastern Europe, imports that had been cut off by the war. American agriculture, by contrast, was producing surpluses so large that the government was paying farmers to reduce production while simultaneously shipping food aid to allied nations around the world. The autumn of 1944 brought news of American military advances in both Europe and the Pacific that reinforced the prisoners' understanding of America's overwhelming material superiority. The breakout from Normandy in July had been supported by logistical operations that moved fuel, ammunition, and supplies at rates that German quartermasters had never achieved. American trucks, including more than 400,000 Studebaker, GMC, and Ford vehicles, were supplying Allied armies across distances that would have been impossible to sustain with German transportation capabilities. In the Pacific, American naval construction was producing aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers at rates that exceeded the combined shipbuilding capacity of all other nations. The Essex-class aircraft carriers, each capable of operating more than 100 aircraft, were being commissioned at a rate of nearly 1 per month. Japanese naval aviation, which had begun the war with technological and tactical superiority, was being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of American production. The prisoners learned these details through American radio broadcasts, newspaper accounts, and conversations with guards and civilian workers. What struck them most was the casual way Americans discussed military production figures. There was no secrecy, no propaganda exaggeration, just matter-of-fact reporting of industrial output that exceeded anything in German experience. December of 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive of the war. For the German prisoners in Arkansas, news of the attack created momentary hope that perhaps the tide of war might turn. But even as they followed the initial German advances, they understood the futility of the effort. The German offensive involved fewer than 300,000 troops supported by limited armor and virtually no air cover. American forces in Europe numbered more than 3 million men supported by overwhelming superiority in tanks, aircraft, artillery, and logistics. The Battle of the Bulge ended in German defeat, but for the prisoners it served as a final demonstration of the resource gap that made German victory impossible. American forces that were defeated in the initial German attack were reinforced, resupplied, and ready to counterattack within days. German forces that achieved initial success found themselves without fuel, ammunition, or air support within hours. The battle illustrated the difference between a military based on industrial abundance and one constrained by critical shortages. By early 1945, even German propaganda had stopped claiming that victory was possible. The German prisoners at Camp Chaffee followed the Allied advance into Germany through American news reports that described the collapse of German resistance with clinical objectivity. The crossing of the Rhine, the encirclement of German armies in the Ruhr, the drive toward Berlin, each development was reported as military news rather than propaganda victory claims. What impressed the German prisoners was the tone of American reporting. There was no hatred, no calls for vengeance, no dehumanization of German soldiers or civilians. American journalists described German military performance with professional respect, criticized Allied tactical mistakes without censorship, and discussed post-war reconstruction plans with matter-of-fact practicality. The contrast with German propaganda, which had become increasingly hysterical as military defeats mounted, was striking. The end came on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. For the German prisoners at Camp Chaffee, the news brought relief rather than despair. They had been expecting this outcome since their arrival in America nearly 2 years earlier. Their education in American industrial capacity had convinced them that German defeat was inevitable regardless of tactical successes or strategic innovations. But surrender did not mean immediate repatriation. The Geneva Convention required rapid return of prisoners of war, but logistical realities made immediate repatriation impossible. More than 425,000 German prisoners were scattered across 700 camps throughout America. The ships and transportation needed to return them to Europe were committed to bringing American forces home from the Pacific, where the war against Japan was still continuing. The delay in repatriation provided the German prisoners with additional months to observe American society and economy. By now, their initial shock at American prosperity had given way to systematic analysis of the factors that made such abundance possible. They understood that American success was not simply a matter of natural resources, though America certainly possessed vast coal, iron, oil, and agricultural resources, but resulted from industrial organization, technological innovation, and social systems that maximized productive efficiency. American factories operated with shift systems that maintained production 24 hours a day. American workers were trained in specialized skills that made them more productive than their German counterparts. American transportation systems, railroads, highways, waterways moved raw materials and finished goods with efficiency that German logistics had never achieved. American financial systems provided capital for industrial expansion at rates that German banks could never match. But perhaps most importantly, American society had achieved a level of social cohesion that allowed maximum mobilization of human resources. The women who worked in defense plants, the civilians who bought war bonds, the farmers who increased production, the scientists who developed new technologies all contributed to a war effort that was voluntary rather than coerced. German war production, by contrast, relied increasingly on forced labor, prisoner labor, and slave labor from occupied territories. The contrast was particularly evident in technological innovation. American research and development programs produced advances in radar, sonar, communications, aviation, metallurgy, chemistry, and nuclear physics that German science could not match. The Manhattan Project, which the German prisoners knew nothing about until the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, represented scientific and industrial cooperation on a scale that German research programs had never approached. The atomic bombs that ended the war against Japan in August 1945 provided the final demonstration of American technological and industrial superiority. The bombs themselves represented scientific breakthroughs that German physicists had been working toward but had never achieved. But more impressive than the scientific achievement was the industrial infrastructure that made the bombs possible. Facilities at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, that employed more than 125,000 workers and consumed electricity at rates that exceeded the power consumption of entire German cities. Repatriation finally began in earnest in 1946, as American shipping became available for the return of German prisoners to Europe. The process was organized with typical American efficiency. Prisoners were processed through transit camps, given medical examinations, issued civilian clothing, and provided with documentation for return to their home regions. But before leaving America, the German prisoners were required to view documentary films of Nazi concentration camps that had been liberated by Allied forces. For many prisoners, including Hartmann, these films provided their first comprehensive understanding of the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. The images of Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Auschwitz were horrifying revelations that forced them to confront the moral dimensions of the war they had fought. The films also provided context for the treatment they had received as prisoners in America. Despite knowing of these atrocities, American guards and civilian workers had treated German prisoners with professional courtesy and respect. The contrast between American behavior and what the films revealed about German treatment of prisoners was stark and shameful. Hartmann sailed from New York on March 15, 1946, aboard the Liberty ship General Lee, accompanied by 2,000 other German prisoners returning to Europe. As the ship left New York Harbor and passed the Statue of Liberty, he found himself reflecting on the nearly 3 years he had spent in captivity in America. "We came here as enemies," he wrote in his diary during the ocean voyage. "We expected harsh treatment, prison conditions, perhaps starvation. Instead, we were fed better than German soldiers in the field, housed better than German workers at home, and treated with respect despite the crimes our nation had committed. We witnessed industrial capacity that exceeded our wildest estimates, agricultural abundance that seemed almost wasteful, and technological capabilities that made German achievements seem primitive by comparison." The ship docked at Bremen on April 2, 1946, and the German prisoners were processed through British-run reception centers before being released to return to their homes. For many, including Hartmann, the contrast between the Germany they returned to and the America they had left was devastating. German cities were rubble-filled ruins where survivors lived in basements and makeshift shelters. Food was scarce, fuel was unavailable, transportation systems were destroyed, and industrial facilities were dismantled or damaged beyond repair. The Germany of 1946 bore no resemblance to the prosperous nation that had launched the war in 1939. Industrial production was less than 1/3 of pre-war levels. Food production was barely sufficient to prevent starvation. Housing shortages were so severe that multiple families shared single rooms in damaged buildings. The contrast with American abundance was so extreme that many returning prisoners found it difficult to describe their experiences to German civilians who had no frame of reference for understanding American prosperity. Hartmann returned to his family farm in Bavaria to find that his parents had barely survived the war. His father had been drafted into the Volkssturm, the last-ditch militia that had defended German towns against Allied armies, and had been wounded in the fighting. His mother had struggled to maintain the farm with no equipment, no fuel, and no help. The horses had been taken by the army, the tractors had been requisitioned for military transport, and the fields had been reduced to subsistence-level production. "You were fortunate to be captured by the Americans," his father told him. "At least you were fed and clothed and treated with decency. We lived on turnips and black bread for 2 years. Many people in the villages died of starvation or disease. The irony was bitter but undeniable. German prisoners of war in America had been better fed, better housed, and better treated than German civilians at home. The nation that had proclaimed German racial superiority and German industrial supremacy had been unable to provide for its own people while its enemies were providing for German prisoners." In the months following his return, Hartmann encountered other returning prisoners from American camps. Their stories were remarkably consistent. Descriptions of American abundance that seemed like fantasies, accounts of industrial capacity that defied German understanding, reports of technological capabilities that made German achievements seem primitive. But most importantly, all carried the same fundamental conclusion. Germany had never possessed the resources necessary to defeat America in a prolonged war. The mathematical reality was simple and devastating. America had produced more than 300,000 aircraft during the war, while Germany produced approximately 120,000. America had manufactured 88,400 tanks, while Germany produced 24,000. American shipbuilding had launched more than 5,000 warships, while German yards had completed fewer than 1,000. In every category of military production, American output had exceeded German production by factors of 2, 3, or 4 to 1. But the quantitative advantages were only part of the story. American equipment was more reliable, more sophisticated, and more adaptable than German equivalents. American logistics were more efficient, American training was more comprehensive, and American strategic planning was more flexible. The German military had achieved tactical excellence in many battles, but American industrial and organizational superiority had made German tactical success irrelevant. The human dimensions of American superiority were equally important. America had mobilized 17 million military personnel, while maintaining civilian industrial production at levels that exceeded peacetime standards. American women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. American minorities had contributed to the war effort despite facing discrimination, and American civilians had supported military production through voluntary programs rather than coercion. Germany, by contrast, had been forced to rely increasingly on slave labor, forced labor, and prisoner labor to maintain industrial production. As American production expanded throughout the war, German production declined due to strategic bombing, resource shortages, and the diversion of manpower to military service. By 1945, German industrial workers were working longer hours for less pay while American industrial workers were earning overtime wages for increased production. The social and political implications of this industrial imbalance were profound. American democracy had proven more effective at mobilizing national resources than German totalitarianism. American capitalism had demonstrated superior organizational efficiency compared to German state-directed economics. American pluralism had generated more innovation and adaptation than German ideological rigidity. These lessons were not lost on the German prisoners who had witnessed American society firsthand. Many, like Hartmann, became advocates for democratic institutions and market economics in post-war Germany. Their experiences in America had convinced them that German defeat had been inevitable and that reconstruction would require learning from American models rather than attempting to restore German traditions. The influence of returned prisoners was significant in shaping post-war German attitudes toward America and democracy. Unlike German civilians who knew America only through propaganda, the returned prisoners had lived in American society and witnessed American capabilities directly. Their accounts of American abundance, American fairness, and American technological superiority helped create receptivity to American influence during the Reconstruction period. By 1950, approximately 5,000 former German prisoners had emigrated to America permanently, taking advantage of immigration opportunities that would have been unimaginable before the war. Thousands of others maintained correspondence with American families, American employers, and American friends they had met during their captivity. The relationships formed between former enemies became personal bridges that facilitated broader reconciliation between Germany and America. The economic recovery of West Germany during the 1950s followed patterns that reflected American influence transmitted through returned prisoners and other contacts. German industry adopted American production techniques, German agriculture implemented American farming methods, and German businesses studied American management practices. The German economic miracle of the post-war years was built on foundations that included lessons learned from observing American abundance. For Klaus Hartmann, the impact of his American captivity shaped his entire post-war life. He completed his education, became an engineer, and eventually established a manufacturing company that employed American production techniques and maintained business relationships with American firms. His diary, preserved throughout his captivity and kept secret during his return to Germany, became a family document that testified to the industrial superiority that had made German defeat inevitable. "We were not defeated by American soldiers," Hartmann wrote in 1950, 5 years after his return from captivity. "We were defeated by American factories. We were not conquered by American generals. We were conquered by American engineers. We did not lose battles. We lost a production war that we never had any chance of winning." The lesson was clear. Military success in modern warfare required industrial capacity that exceeded anything Germany had ever possessed or could have developed. The German prisoners who had witnessed American abundance returned to Germany with understanding that their nation's defeat had been predetermined by resource imbalances that no amount of tactical skill or strategic innovation could overcome. The aircraft factories that produced 96,000 planes per year, the shipyards that launched vessels faster than enemies could sink them, the agricultural system that fed not only America but much of the Allied world, the transportation network that moved supplies across continents and oceans, these represented capabilities that made American victory as inevitable as German defeat. In the broader context of world history, the German prisoner experience in America illustrated the decisive importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare. Nations could achieve tactical success, strategic innovation, and battlefield excellence, but without the industrial infrastructure to sustain prolonged conflict, military advantages became irrelevant. The German prisoners had learned this lesson through direct observation of American society. and their testimony provided compelling evidence for the economic foundations of military power. The story of German prisoners in America was ultimately the story of industrial warfare in the 20th century. It demonstrated that modern conflict was decided not by the quality of individual soldiers or the brilliance of individual commanders, but by the capacity of entire societies to mobilize human and material resources for sustained military effort. America's victory over Germany was not achieved through superior tactics or strategy, but through superior production, superior logistics, and superior economic organization. The 425,000 German prisoners who lived in America during the war returned to Germany with first-hand knowledge of the industrial capacity that had made their defeat inevitable. Their experiences served as a powerful argument for the reconstruction of German society along democratic and capitalist lines, and their influence contributed to the successful integration of West Germany into the Western Alliance during the Cold War. But perhaps most importantly, their stories provided evidence that even in the midst of total war, societies could maintain humanitarian standards and treat enemies with dignity and respect. The German prisoners had expected harsh treatment and had instead received better care than their own people were receiving at home. This demonstration of American values under the stress of war became part of the foundation for post-war reconciliation and alliance between former enemies. The Liberty ships that had carried German prisoners to America in 1943 had been symbols of American industrial might. The passenger ships that returned them to Germany in 1946 carried with them not only individual prisoners, but also knowledge, understanding, and testimony about the society that had defeated them. Their stories became part of the larger narrative of the Second World War, a conflict that was ultimately decided not by military genius or tactical innovation, but by the industrial capacity to outproduce, outsupply, and outlast the enemy. For Klaus Hartmann and his fellow prisoners, their time in American captivity had been an education in the realities of modern industrial warfare. They had learned that Germany's defeat had been inevitable from the moment America entered the war, not because of any failure of German courage or skill, but because of resource imbalances that made sustained resistance impossible. Their testimony stood as evidence that the Second World War had been won not on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, but in the factories, farms, and mines of America. The abundance they had witnessed, the cars on every street, the food in every store, the clothes in every closet, the machines in every factory represented an economic miracle that had made military miracles possible. The American society that had treated them with unexpected kindness and respect was the same society that had produced the weapons, equipment, and supplies that had overwhelmed German resistance. Their captivity had been not just a personal experience, but a window into the economic foundations of American victory and German defeat. As Hartmann wrote in his final diary entry before sailing from New York, "We came to America as prisoners of war, but we leave as witnesses to a prosperity and industrial capacity that our leaders never understood and our people never imagined. We fought bravely, but we were never fighting for victory. We were fighting to delay inevitable defeat. The war was lost not when we surrendered, but when American factories began operating at full capacity. No army could defeat American production, and no strategy could overcome American abundance." The German prisoners of war who witnessed American prosperity during the Second World War became, inadvertently, historians of the economic dimensions of modern warfare. Their testimony provided evidence that industrial capacity, rather than military prowess, had been the decisive factor in Allied victory. Their stories demonstrated that Germany's defeat had been predetermined by resource imbalances that made sustained resistance impossible regardless of tactical skill or strategic innovation. But their experiences also testified to American values that transcended military necessity. The treatment they received, better food, housing, and medical care than many American civilians enjoyed, reflected a society that maintained humanitarian standards even in the midst of total war. Their accounts of American kindness, fairness, and respect provided evidence that victory over fascism had been achieved without abandoning the democratic principles that justified the war. The 425,000 German prisoners who lived in America during the war returned to Germany as witnesses to the industrial miracle that had made American victory inevitable. Their testimony became part of the historical record of the Second World War and contributed to understanding of the economic foundations of military power in the modern era. Their stories provided compelling evidence that the war had been won not by superior military strategy, but by superior industrial organization and economic abundance. The prosperity they had witnessed in America, casual, abundant, almost wasteful by German standards, had been the foundation of Allied victory. The society that could afford to be generous to its enemies was the same society that could afford to fight simultaneous wars in Europe and the Pacific while maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded those of peacetime Germany. The American abundance that had shocked German prisoners was both the cause and the result of American victory in the Second World War. Their captivity had been an education in the realities of industrial warfare, and their testimony stood as evidence that modern conflicts were decided not by the courage of individual soldiers or the brilliance of individual commanders, but by the capacity of entire societies to mobilize human and material resources for sustained military effort. The German prisoners who had witnessed American abundance returned to Germany with knowledge that their defeat had been inevitable, but also with respect for the society that had achieved victory without abandoning its humanitarian principles. In the end, their story was not just about German prisoners of war, but about the economic dimensions of victory and defeat in the 20th century's greatest conflict. They had been witnesses to the industrial capacity that made American victory as inevitable as German defeat, and their testimony provided compelling evidence for the decisive importance of economic factors in modern warfare. Their experiences in American captivity had taught them that wars were won not just on battlefields, but in factories, farms, and mines, and that the society with superior productive capacity would ultimately prevail regardless of tactical advantages or strategic innovations. The abundance they had witnessed, the prosperity they had experienced, and the kindness they had received all testified to the same fundamental truth. America possessed economic advantages that made German victory impossible from the moment the two nations entered into conflict. The German prisoners of war who lived in America during the Second World War returned home as witnesses to this economic reality, and their testimony became part of the historical record of why the war ended as it did. Their story stood as evidence that the Second World War had been decided not by military events, but by economic factors that predetermined the outcome once the full productive capacity of the American economy was mobilized for war. The German prisoners who had witnessed this mobilization firsthand returned to Germany with understanding that their nation's defeat had been inevitable, and their testimony contributed to the broader historical understanding of the economic foundations of Allied victory in the Second World War.